Well, hi there. Welcome to the Sovereign CEO Podcast. I am Caleb Jones, and this is the Sovereign CEO Podcast. And if you're watching the video version of this podcast, you can see I am proudly ensconced on my throne of freedom. I should probably come up with a better name. Anyway, I am finally completely settled in my new office and YouTube studio and all this other good stuff in Dubai. And a number of you, before I get to the topic, let me back up a second. I have two podcasts. A lot of you are new to Sovereign CEO. I have another podcast called the Alpha Male 2.0 podcast, which deals with lifestyle and dating and relationships with women in ways I'm sure you have never heard of before. It's slightly controversial, so it may not be for you, but if you want to check it out, it is at calebjones.com/podcast. And so you can subscribe to both my podcasts. I do the Sovereign CEO podcast once a week and the Alpha Male 2.0 podcast once a week. So if you want all of my content, you should subscribe to both. If you're only interested in business and international lifestyle, then by all means stick with Sovereign CEO. That is perfectly fine. So, since the war in Ukraine has blossomed onto the scene, I am getting a lot of emails from guys who are saying, Caleb, now that there's a war, I'm scared about war. I wasn't scared about war before. I wasn't thinking about war at all. But now that there's a war, now I'm scared about war. This is how human emotions work. And I'm really scared about this. So what if I move abroad and my country I move to goes to war and I'm really scared? I'm a beta. Oh my God, what do I do? So in this podcast, I'm going to talk about how to protect yourself against the likelihood of war if you move out of your collapsing, corrupt, high tax, quasi-authoritarian, quasi-socialist Western country like the United States, Canada, most of Europe, Australia, New Zealand, all the places that speak English pretty much, except Dubai. They speak English here. We're not collapsing here. We're rising. Matter of fact, Dubai is going to double its population by 2040. Woo! Anyway, yes, that is something you want to take into account when you move permanently to another location, or even set up a location as maybe a temporary location, a partial living location where you stay there several months a year. So I'll give you a few of the parameters that I've used, a few of the factors that I've used in order to decide how to structure my Five Flags life in order to avoid the possibility of war. Number one, top of list on things I've talked about. I've mentioned this before, and this is one of my core rules for determining which country I should live in as a living flag. That means a country I'm going to move to and live there permanently or most of the year, or a country I'm going to live part-time. Either one, if I'm going to live there, one of the requirements I have for that country is something I call the adjacent enemy rule. And that means that if for a country to qualify as a living flag for me, now let me back up real quick. When I say living flag, that means I'm going to live there or spend time there. If I want to use it as an economic flag, I don't care about this because I'm not going to live there. That's okay. I can use it for an economic flag. I can use it as a residency flag. I can use it as, you younger guys or you single like to use as a dating flag or a social flag or something like that. That's different. That's fine. I'm just talking here about countries you're going to live in either full-time or part-time. In order to be a candidate for that, it cannot have any adjacent bordering countries that are hostile to that country. So let me give you several examples from my Five Flags life. Some of these I have mentioned, some of these I have not. I chose Dubai, and one of the reasons I chose Dubai to live in is there are no adjacent enemies to Dubai. The United Arab Emirates only borders two countries, Saudi Arabia and Oman. These are two strong allies to the United Arab Emirates. There are no threatening foreign countries adjacent to the UAE. Now, I know what some of you are going to say. Some of you are nitpickers going to say, but what about Iran? What about Iran? What about Iran? I'll cover Iran in a little bit, but Iran is not adjacent. Iran is in the region, but it is not adjacent. If you said to me, I can only live in a country that has no possible enemies anywhere in the region, anywhere near it, that's going to really narrow your list. And the odds of your country being the one country that other country happens to attack is pretty low, maybe even approaching the 2% rule. So a possible flag can have a country that is hostile in the region, or not necessarily hostile to that country, but just kind of an asshole country. You know the names, you know which countries are kind of assholes. United States is one of them. Anyway, that's my point. So you cannot have an adjacent enemy. So this is why, despite the fact that I love Georgia, I did not use Georgia as a place to live. Why? Because as I've been saying for many years, and I've been saying this long before this war in Ukraine occurred, I've been saying this at least 10 years, the problem with countries that border Russia which Georgia does, is that Russia is run by an authoritarian dictator who likes to invade other countries whenever the hell he wants. He already invaded Georgia once in 2008, and no one does anything about it. Right now, you're actually seeing that in action, even though I've been saying this for 10 plus years. So I will never live in any country that borders Russia. You have to deal with the Putin problem, and I don't want to deal with that. So that's why I chose Georgia, an otherwise fantastic country. I love Georgia to death, but I'm not going to live there. I don't want to deal with the possible problem with Putin. I don't want to deal with Russian tanks rolling into my city and having Europe say, don't do that, Putin, and then doing nothing else. I'd rather not go through that. Another example from my Five Flags life is Armenia. I am a resident of Armenia. I love Armenia. I will be there in a few weeks. Love it to death. I would totally live in Armenia, except for one problem, and that is they border a country called Azerbaijan, which likes to shoot missiles into Armenia and have all kinds of border skirmishes because Azerbaijan and Armenia hate each other. So there you go. It has an adjacent enemy, therefore I cannot live there. Now I can still use that country as a flag, and I'm absolutely doing that. But I'm definitely going to be involved in Armenia. I'm going to be going to Armenia several times a year. It's only a 2-hour flight, 3-hour flight from here in Dubai, but I'm not going to live there, because they have an adjacent enemy. See how this works? Now, let me give you another example, Paraguay. My second home is Paraguay. Paraguay borders, let's see what it borders. It borders Argentina, it borders Bolivia, it borders Brazil, and it borders Chile. I think it borders Chile. Boy, I should know this. Anyway, maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. I'll have to check a map later. None of these countries are hostile to Paraguay. Now, yes, again, to address possible nitpickers, many years ago, Bolivia and Paraguay had a little tiny skirmish war, but that was a long time ago. The world is a different place now, so I'm not concerned about that. So that's the reason I chose Paraguay. You see how this all works? It all ties together. So if you just follow that rule, you're going to reduce the odds of having a war problem at any point in your life dramatically. Now, 100%? No. 2% rule? Maybe not even that. But you're going to dramatically reduce the possibility of problems. People who live in countries that border Russia are just asking for problems. People who live in countries that border Iran or Iraq are, asking for problems. Just don't do that. It's very simple. Now, here's a little twist I will add to the adjacent enemy rule. If there is a hostile country to that country that is in the region and hates that country in particular, I also would cross that off the list. An example of that would be Taiwan. I think Taiwan is fucking amazing. I love Taiwan. It's a fantastic country. Would I ever live in Taiwan? No. You know why? You got too many Chinese missiles and tanks and airplanes and naval vessels pointed at Taiwan while China's just slobbering, ready to invade and attack Taiwan whenever they get the chance. That's probably not a good place to live. Now, is China adjacent to Taiwan? Technically, no. There's a waterway in between them, just like there's a waterway between here, where I live, and Iran. But the difference is China is gunning for Taiwan. Iran is not gunning for the UAE. Iran is gunning for other places, maybe Israel, other places like that, but not the UAE. Iran does not have a particular vendetta against the UAE, even though it is in the region. This is also a reason, by the way, I didn't choose South Korea as a place to live. I love South Korea. It's amazing. I'm probably going to go there next year. But here's the problem. You got too many missiles pointed at you from that crazy little guy right across the border, so I'm not living there. You see how this all works? So just cover these bases, pull out a map, and look at what countries that country borders and see if those countries are friendly or at least neutral to that country, and you'll save yourself a lot of hassle. Now, let me address specifically the issue of having a dangerous country in the region, for example, Iran. I have had a number of people say, when I say I live in Dubai, oh, you live in Dubai? Aren't you worried about Iran attacking Dubai? In those types of scenarios, you need to look at the facts, as always, the objective facts and the objective realities and not your fears. You need to do the research. So let me give you a few things on Iran attacking Dubai. Why the fuck would Iran attack Dubai? First of all, as I said, Iran does not have a stick up its butt about the UAE specifically. There are many other countries that Iran hates much more than the UAE. So for Iran to just randomly attack specifically the UAE and specifically Dubai for no reason would be very, very, very improbable, perhaps even in the 2% rule. And that's number one. Number two, if Iran actually were to lob missiles, and I'm going to say missiles, because if Iran actually launched a conventional war against Dubai, against the UAE, they'd have a big problem. UAE has its own air force, plus we are bordering Saudi Arabia, which is a strong ally. Saudi Arabia is also allied to the United States, kind of. And so Iran would have a big problem on its hands. So, but let's say for some reason in a fantasy land, Iran wanted to lob missiles into Dubai for no reason. Iran wouldn't do that because Iran is not suicidal. Number one, I've talked about this before. This is why the USSR never lobbed missiles against the United States during the Cold War when I was a child, because the USSR might be angry. They might be totalitarian. I'm talking about the USSR now, not necessarily Russia. They might be those things or were those things, but they're not suicidal. They want to kill themselves. Iran, specifically the leaders of Iran, are not crazy. They're not suicidal. They're not going to lob missiles in any country which they know would enrage the world and put the fury of the United States on top of Iran's neck. They don't want to do that. And Iran, by the way, knows the United States loves to invade countries. And they're looking for a reason to invade Iran, and they have for at least 30 years. Secondly, a big portion of the population of Dubai and the UAE in general are Pakistanis and Indians. If Iran was stupid and insane enough to lob missiles into Dubai, they would kill many, many Indians and many, many Pakistanis, enraging the countries of India and Pakistan. India and Pakistan are nuclear powers, and Iran knows this. Do you seriously think Iran would risk nuclear devastation just to lob some missiles into the United Arab Emirates, a country it doesn't hate nearly as much as many other countries it would rather attack? No. So now we're down to the 2% rule, and now that's why I'm okay living in Dubai, and you are too if you like Dubai, and you really don't have to worry about Iran specifically. So that's an example of the type of analysis you have to do when there's a scary neighbor in the region and determining whether or not that neighbor is a risk. Now, if I did the analysis of China's risk against Taiwan, very different story. I personally think it's simply a matter of time before China makes some kind of move against Taiwan. It could be tomorrow, it could be 10 years from now, but I think it's just a matter of time as the United States continues to collapse and continues to decline and China continues to rise despite the many things China's doing wrong. I think it's just a matter of time. Very different scenario than Iran versus UAE, or I don't know, Venezuela versus Paraguay or something stupid like that. You see my point? I hope that makes sense. One of the questions you have to ask yourself is, why would this country attack this other country completely offensively and not in a scenario of self-defense? Now, another question you should ask is your country that you're planning on moving to, could they offensively attack another country? If you live in the United States, the answer is a big fuck yes. The United States is in 8 different wars right now against 8 different countries. Most of you didn't even know this. And none of these countries attacked the United States. The United States is famous all over the world for attacking countries offensively when these countries did nothing to them. So if you live in the United States, guess what that means? Either you risk these countries attacking the United States, which probably won't happen because the United States runs the world, or in the United States case, or a Western country's case, you're going to have to deal with things like terrorism. I've said many times before that if you live in Switzerland or Hong Kong, you don't have to worry about terrorism. Why? Because countries like Switzerland and Hong Kong don't attack other countries. Kind of nice. So that's another question you should ask. Is this the kind of country that would just get a burr up its ass and go attack some other country for some stupid reason, like the United States, like the UK, like many other Western countries, like Putin in Russia, etc. The last factor you should look at is, how hard is it to attack the country in which you live? If someone did actually launch some sort of conventional warfare, tanks and airplanes and crap like that, guys with guns sent into the country, how easy would it be to attack the country in terms of the landscape and in terms of the borders and things like that? One of the reasons that Switzerland has done so well throughout most of human history is because it is very, very fortified with mountain ranges that protect the Swiss people. Kind of neat. One of the cool things about moving to Colombia, matter of fact, Jim Rogers, if you know who that is, has pointed this out. If you live in Colombia and someone were to launch a conventional war against Colombia, that would be extremely difficult. You got mountains, you got jungles, it'd be a mess. Very different than driving tanks and airplanes into Dubai. It's just flat desert. That's one of the reasons that Saddam Hussein suddenly attacked Kuwait. It was easy. There were no barriers and landmarks in between those two nations. Once again, those countries were bordering each other. So living in Kuwait back when Iraq was an enemy probably wasn't a good idea. So that would be the final factor if you're still worried about this. What are the logistics involved in attacking that country if you find that's likely? And again, if you've done everything else I just talked about, that likelihood is very low, probably well into the 2% rule. Therefore, you don't worry about it. Lastly, I will end with this. Standard sovereign CEO baseline. And I've done videos on this on YouTube. I've talked about this before. Where can you be in 72 hours? I'm going to keep saying that over and over and over and over and over again. Where can you be in 72 hours? There's a YouTube video on this. I suggest if you haven't seen it, go to my YouTube channel, Sovereign CEO, and watch that video. The objective is you need to get to the point where you can be on the ground, your feet on the ground in some other country within 72 hours with minimal problems. Not you get on the plane in 72 hours. You are actually in the country in 72 hours. If, God forbid, there was some kind of military problem on its way to Dubai, very low odds, I'm not concerned about it for the reasons I just stated. But let's say in a fantasy world that happened. I could be in Paraguay, my feet on the ground in Paraguay in less than 72 hours. I can be in Mexico in less than 24 hours. I can be in Armenia in less than 8 hours, 9 hours, 10 hours. So I have numerous places I can go, all of which where I have residency and I have logistics all set up where I can just throw stuff in a backpack, hop on a plane with my wife, and within literally 72 hours or much less, we'd be in another country and we'd be safe. So that's a core component of your long-term safety as we continue into this dark age in which we have entered. Where can you be in 72 hours? And if your brain goes, shit, nowhere, that's something you should start working on. That's why I talk about a plan B, an international backup plan. So if anything happens horrible to your country, and if you live in a Western country, the odds are very high as they continue to collapse, but other countries too, where can you be in 72 hours? It's not like I live in Dubai and my entire life is focused on Dubai. I have flags all over the world. Very soon I'll have a house in Mexico, I'll have an apartment in Dubai, I'll have land in various other places. I'm covered. And I have residency in, like I said, 6 different countries. So no matter what, I'm covered. Are you covered? Food for thought. So use those techniques. Don't freak out about war just because you happen to see one going on right now. War is part of the European lifestyle and the American lifestyle. Get the hell out of America. Get the hell out of Europe. You'll have much less of a problem. I will see you in the next podcast. Have fun. Bye.